What we're going to do, and to me, this sounds like a lot of fun, because I will ask our panelists questions, and then they will say things. And we'll do that back and forth for a while. I've got to watch, and we'll go to about maybe 10 after 1. So we're scheduled to go all the way to 1:30, and I'll work to hold at least 20 minutes for questions from the audience. And I'll also play it by ear a little bit. If you all feel like there are burning questions, you could signal to me, and kind of I'll see. I want to start, though, with the panel kind of having a chance to say what their impressions are. What we'll do is, first of all, go with after the second thing I'll do is go with a question to every panelist. But first, Claire Bowen, and Claire, I think you've been warned about this, that we want to give you a chance to just give us the short summary or overview of what the mobility plan is and where it's at.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Okay. So the plan was a 4-year effort. It was adopted in August of this year, which was, I think, a huge kind of monumental kind of moment in time. And it really, from my perspective, it's a policy document. It really sets forth the opportunity for the city to really rethink how it thinks about transportation in the city. It really positions the city to be much more mindful of the needs and the role of pedestrians and people who bicycle and people who take transit and people who also still need to drive trucks and cars. It's really a plan that says that our streets are for much more than just moving vehicles. They're really for accommodating a wide range of users. And we need to be much more mindful of all of those users when we're making decisions as a city. So it's hopefully positioning us in all of our departments and our partners out in the community. So as we make decisions and build out our infrastructure over the next 20 years, that we're doing it kind of with that mindset.
Okay, great. Now to me, let me have my own editorial comment briefly. This is exciting. Sometimes I meet people, and often these people are more from the East Coast than the West Coast, and they'll go into a soliloquy about how they don't like Los Angeles because it's so auto-oriented, and you can't get anywhere without driving. And then they'll go on and on for a while about this, about how they wouldn't be able to stand living here because they couldn't get anywhere without driving, and then they'll pause. And I'll say, well, this is interesting. Do you know that the city you're imagining does not exist? And then usually they get confused and walk away. And so, but this is about really a transformation that Los Angeles is part of. Let me ask a question, and I think Rick will start with you and then go down the road this way. I want to ask each panelist, discuss what in your mind will be the biggest benefit from the mobility plan, and then also what you think might be the biggest risk point.
Well, we run a little bit of a detriment here because all of us believe in this vision and this direction. So what's missing from the panel is the alternative view,
Yeah.
the defense of the status quo. And so someone, to make this even halfway interesting, I think needs to begin by pointing out that a plan in the city of Los Angeles has no teeth. It's a nice thing, and Claire has done extraordinary and heroic work in shepherding it through to, was it unanimous or 14-1 or something?
It was 13-2.
13-2. So a nearly unanimous city council. So it's not to diminish the symbolic significance of it, but the city of Los Angeles has 16 planning directors, 17, I guess. One has the title, and then the mayor and the city council members all act as planning directors as well. And so even at the very same time that the city was adopting a visionary planning document, it was being quite literally ignored in for example, the decision pushed through to redo the bridge on Glendale Avenue that is going to be pushed through to be an auto-oriented bridge because the council member from that district wants it that way. So when you ask the question, what's the greatest benefit, that assumes that the plan will actually come to pass. And I think that's an open question. I think we're going to have to make it come to pass. And then we can sort of talk about the benefits. And the greatest detriment is that we've raised expectations that we won't be able to deliver on. We're clearly in an awkward position that's not unlike Los Angeles in the teens and 20s, when we were basically built around the red car system. And automobiles were a disruptive force, and we didn't quite know what to do with them. And so you had a lot of accidents, you had a lot of congestion, you had a lot of confusion, you had a lot of territorial fights. And out of that, there was a bare-knuckled fight to the death. And it was going on in other cities in the country. But that bare-knuckled fight to the death was won by the car. They killed one of the great interurban railway systems in the world, and triumphed, making Southern California the sort of ground zero for automobility. So we're in that same kind of fight now. And passing a plan is a nice thing, but getting the plan implemented is probably 99% of the battle, and it is a fight to the death. It is not something where we can, I don't mean that we're going to kill cars, but we are going to have to kill the mentality that cars come first. And that mentality is wired into the vast majority of codes and practices of all planning departments, including the city of Los Angeles, in fact, including the city of Santa Monica. So disembodying that mindset is a raging battle, and we're going to be very polite here because we're all on the side of the angels. But the reality is out there, and Claire's already encountered it. There is a fierce, popular backlash that says enough with these bikes, enough with spending money on transit. The car is the way we have to get around, and we'll block every effort to implement the vision that's embodied in the new plan.
Yeah, well stated. Claire?
Rick is absolutely right, and that is really the biggest challenge we have. It's a policy document. We did do a few things. We actually did redesignate every arterial in the city, but the full implementation of the plan really will completely depend upon departments, really using the plan to kind of make decisions in a new way. I mean, for example, the bridge is a good example. Luckily we've already been in conversation with the folks in Bureau of Engineering. They're coming to us, and this is really kind of a new way of doing things. And they're saying, we've got all these capital projects kind of in queue. What do we do? And just the fact that they're asking planning how to approach this. And so we're all going to meet together and talk about, well, maybe a project that's already 75% through the design, we may not be able to kind of correct course. Maybe there's projects that are only 25% through, and we can start to make some adjustments once we start to look at the funding source and the kind of the timing. So I think that the plan, let's just maybe be put aside for a moment all the obstacles that are in front of us, and let's just talk about what we think really are kind of the benefits. If we really were successful in implementing, all the different things the plan talks about, I think we're going to make, we would make safer streets. And in kind of making safer streets, you're going to make people much more comfortable and walking, and then hopefully more people then start to do it, and starts to then kind of put on more pressure to the electeds to start to do more of those things. So we know that when you look at cities around the world, when you actually put these infrastructure changes in place, that you start to then have the kind of the data to be able to defend some of the things you're doing, and you look at which are the things that are the most productive and beneficial from a cost perspective. And what we're hoping is that as you start to do kind of these investments in different communities, whether it's a protected bicycle lane or just even doing bump outs to make the crossings shorter and safer, and you do things that now start to make it so that the cars are going slower. We've actually set a targeted operating speed for every arterial in the cities, which is, again, is a major shift Because before we always used to tell our engineers, just design those streets so they go 55 miles an hour, but then post it at 35, and then we kind of get surprised when people actually go 55 at night. So we're saying to the engineers, and again, the engineers have positively responded. They're just like, tell us what the rules are. The rules were this way. We're making a fundamental shift. So again, if we start to really design our streets, again, this is an incremental thing. These are many, many miles of streets. It's going to take a lot of money. But as you incrementally do these things, you're going to hopefully, again, see safer streets. You're going to see people much more willing to let their kids bike or walk to school. More people will start to then, again, use those things. We're having a lot of conversations with Metro, because again, a lot of it's going to require planning and all the other departments to stay very engaged with our partners to make sure that, and encourage, Metro to start thinking about, let's actually maybe look at where are some places where we can do some additional kind of bus-only lanes. So again, if we do all those things, hopefully we have made a safer, a higher quality environment. Streets are really the public face of cities, that what we present to the world. And I don't think our streets are particularly a positive feature for the city right now. I mean, there's places where we've done it, and those are some of the places like the mayor was trying to look at kind of great streets. Our streets have amazing potential. They just really haven't risen up to it. And hopefully the plan starts to, again, kind of lay out the framework and how we can actually make the transformation of our city streets to be able to a positive feature. I think the biggest risk is letting the folks that Rick just talked about, again, these naysayers, and they are a very organized, I like to still say they're fairly small, but they're a very organized and very powerful group of folks. I think the biggest risk is letting them own this conversation. And I think we're going to have to do probably even a better job than we're doing now. I think we probably still struggle with kind of the PR messaging to help our council people and, again, the other city leaders, give them the kind of the ammunition to be able to kind of like not listen to those voices so loudly, and be willing to kind of make some of the difficult decisions to implement the plan.
And Marlon, the boulevards of Paris are a classic example of the potential of having streets along the lines of what Claire's just outlined. The colossal private real estate value, but even more profound public value. Who wouldn't want to live in Paris? And it's held its value. Those streets were laid out in the 1870s. We're now in the 21st century, and no one has done it better. And it's through war and depression and everything else, Paris has continued to maintain this extraordinary magnet and vitality. It's the center of one of the world's great cultures. So Los Angeles, the potential is there for not only tremendous private value that can pay for a lot of the things that we're talking about, but even more the quality of life, which is the great paradox. The people who are fighting this battle on the other side, they're fighting very much for their quality of life. But they're fighting a rearguard battle for a quality of life that's not coming back. We are not going to get back to free-flowing 1950s freeways and the ability to get from Santa Monica to USC in 15 minutes. That is never coming back, but that's what they're fighting for, because that's what they remember and that's what they'd like to get back to.
Yeah. And let me follow up on that and move it to you, Vinayak. But I think that's exactly right. I mean, our best measures of traffic congestion in major U.S. cities suggest that delay hours have tripled over the last 3 decades, and there's no reason to think that we can run that in reverse. And I'm not going to do it, but I could articulate a lot of, I think, very sound reasons why that traffic congestion delay hour will logically continue to rise in the future. But that's a depressing story. If you go to people and say, look, you're trying to preserve an image of your quality of life that is going away, I found that I've never made people happy by telling them that, and I've tried it myself quite a lot. So what I want to ask you, Vinayak, I want to change the question a little bit. You can jump in on the previous question also, but do we have stories about the positive quality of life here in LA that we can point to? Are there things that we can tell people that, we could say, look at a place here, and this is what we could be moving towards?
Okay, so let me begin with a small episode of animal behavior, which I think applies to this situation cursorily. If you take a frog And if you put a frog in a beaker of water, and you turn the flame, you put it on a stove and you turn the flame, and the water starts to boil, the frog is going to jump out of the beaker and run for his life. But if you take the same beaker of lukewarm water and you turn the flame ever so slightly, just absolutely alive in the smallest sense, and what's happening is the water is getting tepid and getting warm 1 degree per 5 minutes. And with every rise in temperature, the frog is adjusting its body temperature and is happily living in the water, thinking that life is good. And I think this is an important analogy, and eventually the frog cooks to death. So
And this is where I want to add for students, don't actually do this. But okay.
But I think every time I've thought of LA and other cities, I've thought of this analogy because I think, to Rick's point, we've had a long history of how the landscape of LA changed from what it used to be. I mean, I don't have to remind you, barely 60 years ago, our region had the largest train network in the world. I mean, we had more than 1,000 miles of train tracks. And they were systematically and consciously dismantled. And by the 60s, they were all gone. And life took over. But I think this analogy holds true because we've now reached a point where we've all sort of adjusted our temperature and our body temperature to a life in LA which we either love or hate, but we've learned to live with it. And so anything that comes in, whether it's a mobility plan or a transformative planning idea, is going to be received with some kind of skepticism. But I feel personally that we have also been adjusting our temperature the other way because, if I was to contextualize the mobility plan, this to me personally is the teleological end of a very, very long set of reflections in the Los Angeles region. I mean, I came to LA in '96. 70% of downtown itself was lying empty. The Disney Concert Hall was under construction. The cathedral was under construction. There was a lot of hullabaloo about how these two buildings would save downtown, just to make a point. But what nobody was noticing is downtown LA was being resurrected beautifully, quietly, by adaptive reuse ordinances, multimodality, parklets, all kinds of lovely things were going on. And they were actually making much bigger difference in the lives of people than some amazing big crescendos, which are wonderful. So what I'm trying to say is, I think we've seen the death of malls in LA. We've seen the transformation of malls into lifestyle centers in Los Angeles. I mean, there's been an incredible reverse revolution of people coming back into the urban center, wanting to live in urban centers. There's a bike culture. We've had precedents now. City of Santa Monica, a few weeks ago, I believe, passed the first official bike plan in the region, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, there are examples all around us that signal, I think, the coming of age of an utopian metropolis. And I see this plan as a readjustment of the temperature. I don't see it as a shock in any form or the other. It's a gradual edification of a lot of the things that we've all been thinking about subconsciously for a very, very long time.
Marlon, let me jump into your rephrasing of the question and offer Atwater Village. So if I threw out the revitalization of Hollywood or Silver Lake or Abbot Kinney in Venice, everyone, okay, got that. That's where hipsters in black come in, drink a lot of coffee, and you get Paris. The Atwater Village is a different and I think more significant case study. So it's still a very wide boulevard. In fact, I'm sure it was an old red car line because it has the boulevard median for where the tracks would have been. So therefore, it's fairly wide. And it like most neighborhood centers had suffered the decline to vacancies and marginal businesses. And when Eric Garcetti was on the city council, he applied some of the same lessons that had come out of the much more studied and highly visible case studies of Silver Lake and Echo Park and Hollywood. And Atwater Village has undergone the same kind of gradual adjustment that Vinayak is observing and advocating for. So you go to Atwater Village, yes, there is a fancy French bakery, but there's also a hardware store. There's also the vast majority of the businesses actually cater to the working class and middle class residents. There has not been a giant leap in prices. There has not been kind of nosebleed gentrification. There's not been an emptying out of the neighborhood. There's been a what we used to call revitalization. New life come back into the neighborhood. A neighborhood that maintained a lot of strength. And how did that happen? It happened by all of the same prescriptions of beginning to do traffic calming, of angled parking, of bringing the intersections closer together for pedestrians. Those are physical transformations, but there was also a much more profound change in mindset, which is this neighborhood, rather than drive to some place that's a mall or a shopping center, let's shop in our own local community. And let's not just shop there, let's go there for our exercise, go there for our library, go there because we're going to meet our friends and our neighbors, and the kid that I know from the soccer practice, I'm going to meet their parents at the coffee shop. So Atwater Village, I think, is an example of how these lessons could be applied much more broadly across Southern California. That this is not something that is for a tiny percentage of early adopters.
Yeah.
That this is actually something that can be applied all across the landscape.
Vinayak, you, and then we'll go back to you, Claire.
I think there are two other examples. I mean, when we talk about mobility, mobility is not just about kinesis, it's also about static. I mean, parking, for example, is a huge aspect of mobility balances. I think there are very important two cities that I think pioneered a couple of things. The parking standpoint should not be forgotten, and that is, again, in whatever order, Santa Monica and Pasadena, because I think what these two cities did in their downtowns remains exemplary to the larger discussion of mobility in LA, which was the transformation of parking. And if you look at both these cities, essentially, I've spoken to some of the planners. I mean, imagine a downtown core where you were parking right next to every building. And the parking ratio, if you take it in terms of your legal zoning, was about at an average 4 cars per 1,000 square feet or something like that. But when you look at the usage of how much is being used every day, 50% of it is lying unused. So you're wasting, it's a disinvestment into the downtown core. And what these cities have done, as you've seen, is actually created a park once idea where you've consolidated parking into garages. You basically go and park in the garage, and by default, you now walk. It's kind of a strange thing when you look at it from a different standpoint, because you have people from Rancho Cucamonga now driving all the way to Santa Monica to walk for about 2 hours, which sounds kind of strange, but that's the way it is. But what they've done is two things. They've encouraged walkability in a different way. By default, you've had to create beautiful streets, beautiful environments, but you've reduced the parking ratio on a cumulative level to less than 1 per 1,000 or 1.5 per 1,000, because now there's no wastage of parking and it's completely consolidated. And I asked a planner in Pasadena once, how did you achieve it? Maybe Rick, you were the mayor at that time, I don't know. How were you able to convince a community that you had to park in one spot and then walk to all the shops for about 3 blocks? I mean, that was unheard of in the 60s or 70s or 80s. And they said, well, we basically told them that when you go to a suburban mall, you actually do the same thing, don't you? You actually park in a gigantic parking lot, a mile away from the store that you want to go to, walk through a parking lot, go into the enclosed air-conditioned mall, and then find your shop, and life is good. And we're going to give you the exact same thing. All we're going to do is consolidate the parking in one spot, and it worked. But I think the mobility discussion intrinsically extends into how walkability is linked to the parking idea, and therefore begins to spawn placemaking, which is intrinsic to the report.
Which is why go ahead.
Which is exactly what I was going to talk about, is that land uses, even though this is a mobility plan, there's a whole rest of our general plan which talks about the importance of congregating variety of uses. Partly the reason that Atwater is working so well, not only the streets have been improved, but that's then attracted businesses to want to come into the area. And then you start to have that consolidation of a variety of uses in the area, layered with then a quality of a streetscape system, and then hopefully some central parking. And now all of a sudden you've eliminated the need for somebody to drive a long distance. So it's kind of, again, it's part of this whole cycle of things we're going to need to kind of do together. And all of a sudden people are not going to mind. Maybe it's going to take an hour to drive somewhere, because they don't need to drive that hour anymore, because all the things they want to get to are in their neighborhoods.
And that's why I wear long sleeves, is because of the battle scars from the battles in Pasadena. And I used to say that my 3 greatest achievements as mayor of Pasadena were the adoption of our general plan, which has been the crux of 20 years of increasingly sophisticated success. Number 3 was getting parking meters in Old Pasadena. Number 2 was not getting recalled for getting parking meters in Old Pasadena. And I raised that because even though it's now somewhat musty history, it re-emphasizes that without progress or without struggle, there's no progress, right? Mm-hmm. Basic Frederick Douglass, those who want to see progress without struggle are those who want to see, rain without thunder and lightning. The nature of urban engagement is struggle, and it doesn't have to be toxic struggle. It doesn't have to. We don't have to make enemies of people who think differently from us, but there is a huge struggle to change the mindset and to get people to realize that this journey that they're on in a suburban mall is far more pleasant on an urban street, mm-hmm. if that urban street is clean, if that urban street is safe, which is a dimension that finally Los Angeles is learning, because when the adaptive reuse ordinance was put in, which is a phenomenal success, the dimension that was neglected in fixing the buildings didn't fix the streets.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And by fixing the streets, I don't mean just paving them. I mean dealing with the urban pathologies and the systematic disinvestment in the public realm. The public realm is dirty, broken, and unsafe. And so creating, and then that's not the experience you have between your car and the parking lot in the mall. So creating a pleasant, urban environment. And that's where the engineering department and the public works department and the police department and the fire department and the public health department, all of those come into play, because you can't just change the physical form. You also have to create the environment where people feel welcome and safe, and where you can plant flowers and somebody's going to take care of them.
Let me follow up by asking a question, and it follows on your comment, Rick, but to keep a flow, I'll go to Claire first, and then we'll branch out. But the political dimension of what we're talking about, talking about that this is a struggle, and talking about how to unwire the car mentality. What are the key things, and Claire, I'll start with you, that you would advise to people that they really need to keep an eye on? If this plan is going to be anything more than just kind of a book on a shelf, what is it that advocates of the plan need to be thinking about in a political arena?
Whoa. I would say that it's going to be really important for advocates to push for and really encourage the city, or to start doing really some demonstration projects. I think, again, if you start to actually make some physical changes in areas, we're a huge city, and you can spend a lot of money and kind of really not see what you've done. So if we can really find some places and work together to be able to actually kind of do some demonstration sites, which is maybe like really looking again at the Great Streets model and doing similar things to that. So that starts to then make it easier for the politicians, because again, you want to be able to get them on our side, and we know a lot of them are there, but we need to continue to help them. So we need to continue to provide positive experiences so that so more and more people start to call them and say, well, I want that, as opposed to, because they respond a lot to phone calls.
Okay, all right. Vinayak, and then we'll go back to Rick.
Sure. In my opinion, the most transit-oriented city in the world, just to make a point for me, is Tokyo, which I know extremely well. And Tokyo started changing its landscape, just making a point here. Tokyo started changing its landscape in the 60s. It invested very heavily at the peak of the economic boom into transit, and the rest is history, as many of you know. But if you actually ask why there's ridership in Tokyo, why do people in Tokyo in massive amounts, like 90%, 80% of cities actually take the trains? It's because of the quality of transit. Mm-hmm. It's not because there is transit only, but because it's clear that the quality of transit gives you a status quo, an association, a joy, an experience of urbanity which is second to none. And I think one of the key aspects of starting this plan, not to mention small steps and so on and so forth, is the quality of this monitoring the quality of what people are actually looking at. I think is going to be a crucial point. Success of mobility planning in any city has never just been about mobility availability. It's actually been about quality, whether it's in Copenhagen or in Tokyo. I'll stop at that. I'll come back to it. So that's one point.
Okay.
Go ahead, Rick.
So I know a little bit about politics.
Indeed.
And
More than a little.
And I think it's not that complicated for everyone here to understand. Any of you ever do arithmetic? So on a 5-member council, you have to count to 3. On a 7-member council, you have to count to 4. On a 15-member council, you have to count to 8. On election day, you have to get one more vote than the person you're running against. It's arithmetic. So then the question is, how do you get 3 out of 5, 4 out of 7, 8 out of 15, 50.1%? And there are 2 ways to do that. One is to convert people who are inclined to be on the other side and to make a compelling case for why it's in their interest to vote for whatever the proposition might be, whether it's a mobility plan or, more importantly, the implementation of the mobility plan. That's one way, is to address particularly the people who are the least entrenched in opposition. The other is to get more people to show up who are for it. So in Los Angeles politics, that means people who are younger, people who are less affluent, people who are, and of course in Southern California, that means people of color, more often than not. So it means creating constituencies of the disempowered. And if they don't vote, they lose. And so it is, it's basic organizing. And so I think in order to be successful, you have to do both. You have to appeal to people in a way that inspires them to think differently. And then you have to bring people who have to think differently, the bus riders, the pedestrians, the people without cars, the people who can't afford to live in the suburbs, who are stuck in neighborhoods in Los Angeles that are shamefully neglected. And yet, why are they shamefully neglected year in and year out, decade after decade? Because of lack of political power of those neighborhoods. So you have to address that imbalance of political power. There's no magic answer to that, but the single most extraordinary thing that has happened in the last 5 years in Los Angeles is Ciclavia. Because on one day, a group of people take over the streets. And the streets belong to people riding bikes, walking, skateboarding, what have you, and demonstrate that people love it. Thousands of people come out of the woodwork of all colors, of all backgrounds, and show that there is a constituency. Before Ciclavia, that constituency was invisible not only to the powers that be, but to each other. And then you go on a Ciclavia and you look around and you say, this is the future of Los Angeles. So the next step is to translate the Ciclavia recreational experience of a single afternoon into political power that can count to 3 or to 4 or to 8 or to 50.1% on election day. That's how change happens in a representative democracy.
Just want to say one more thing.
Yes.
There's another dimension of this which we should not forget, and that is developers. You know, we usually don't talk about them, but they have an intrinsic relationship with the mobility plan, I think. We talk about TODs usually, we talk about transit, the T comes first, but it's conceivable that the D is equally important as well. So it is possible, for example, that pilot projects could be strategically located in areas of significant visibility and density. Conversely, as as opposed to taking the other stance that you need mobility in order to bring density. But the other concurrent discussion about this is that we need to be urgent about talking about writing regulations and incentivizing developers into potentially making appropriate development around a mobility plan. Because what we have in the mobility plan is a set of policies that talks about better streets, better slowing down streets, encouraging walkability and all those things. But what this is, if you think about it as an extension of the general plan, is an incentive for a lot of other things. When Janet Sadiq Khan became the Transportation Commissioner in New York, her first line, I believe, was, "I am now the biggest real estate developer in New York." Because she knew that, which was a fantastic line, because she knew that of the miles and miles of streets that she was going to now control is actually real estate, both within it and around it. So I think that concurrent synergy is going to be crucial to this equation.
Yeah. Let me ask a question. How should we think about and approach mobility in terms of an equity perspective? Because the comments that we're getting now seem to be moving very much towards the idea that the mobility plan either can be or possibly ought to be an equity tool to redress inequities in neighborhoods. But let me suggest a couple of points to frame this. I think there's a lot of neighborhoods in Los Angeles that may be uncertain whether transportation can help or hurt them. And if you look at development, the Blue Line is a quarter century old. And I can go to Blue Line stations and point to lots that probably look exactly the same way today that they look tomorrow. Expo Line Phase 2 in Santa Monica has yet to start service, and we have seen development occur in anticipation. And so I don't know. I mean, is this a plan that is for every neighborhood, or should it be, or is it not? I don't know. Claire, I'll bounce that to you.
Equity is a big part of this plan. We think that it's really, really critical to be looking at data, looking at the areas where you've got the highest densities, where you've got the lowest incomes, looking at communities who have the lowest number of cars, which oftentimes, again, are in the communities with the lower income levels. So there are a lot of part of the cities that have been neglected in terms of either street infrastructure or transit infrastructure. And that's why we say that we should be using data when we're making decisions about where we're putting our improvements. That's why the city right now is focusing on its higher injury network. Again, looking at data, there's a where have the streets really failed people? Where are, again, the most deaths and collisions occurring? But we also want to use that same data to be looking at like the transit system. For example, it's one of the reasons the Transit Enhanced Network we think is so important, because the rail system is not going to be able to go everywhere in the next 20 years. We just cannot build rail everywhere, but we think that regardless of where you live in the city, you should have access to a frequent, reliable transit system. So that's why, working with Metro to be able to put in rapid bus lanes, bus-only lanes, so you can provide that kind of frequent, reliable service. And we should starting to do that in the places where the communities, most need it. They're already looking at Vermont Corridor as a good example of that, and actually in Van Nuys again. So,
Rick? Is that a way to broaden the coalition, to bring out people who, for example, come to Ciclavia?
Yes, although in America, this is the fundamental moral, political, and economic choice of our generation, which is not transportation. Sorry. It is economic and social justice in our society. We can have great transportation, but if our society continues to pull apart, then that's not the America I grew up in, it's not the America I believe in, and it's not the America that will thrive as America has striven over the last 200 years to become a more perfect union. The radical divergence of our society into a very wealthy elite and a much larger impoverished population is the fundamental challenge for our generation and the generation to come. Now, transportation absolutely is a component to that. For the last 50 years, there have been two choices. You could own a car, or you could not own a car, and then you were subject to the bus, right? It was never anyone's first choice. Mm-hmm. It was always the default. So that is separate and unequal. And that's fundamentally wrong. And so what we're talking about now is choices. So there need to be a whole range of choices available to everyone in our society, the poor, the disabled, the young, the elderly. Everyone has a right to move around. And just as everyone has a right to have a roof over their head, everyone has a right to medical care, everyone has a right to human dignity, everyone has a right to political representation. This is what America is about. And the segregation of our neighborhoods and the segregation into automobility and lack of automobility is one of the fundamental divides that this is about changing. So absolutely, it is about broadening the coalition, and it's about redefining the coalition. This is not a coalition just for livable streets, so some people can ride bikes. This is about creating healthy, prosperous, and sustainable cities for the human habitat, because 50% of the world's population live in cities today. In 25 years, 70% of the world's population. The human habitat is the city. And if the city is wealthy enclaves and slums in Kinshasa and Johannesburg and Jakarta and Shenzhen, then what is the future of our species on this planet? We have to, in a city as advantaged as Los Angeles, set an example of true equity, whether it's transportation, education, access to parks. Equity has to be at the center of everything we do.
I agree with Rick completely that I think the biggest problem with giving choices in LA is we already have too many choices. I mean, we have the car, I don't take the Gold Line from Pasadena to downtown because it's less convenient than driving in the early mornings and so on and so forth. We have choices already, and that actually delays us from doing a lot of progressive things. But this is where you can talk about a city like, say, Curitiba. I think we all know Curitiba, but there are a lot of things we don't know about Curitiba. I myself didn't know enough about Curitiba until I read enough deeply about it. And this was about equity. So it was in 1971, Jaime Lerner became the mayor of Curitiba. And as we all know, there were a lot of funds placed for all kinds of highways and all kinds of things. And what we know is the world-class BRT system that they proposed. But what we don't, I hope you know what I'm talking about. In the major avenues, Curitiba was a downtown. It was a dictatorship. What they did is they passed a moratorium. They stopped all development in downtown. And instead of letting the city sprawl with roads and automobile transit, they actually created 5 spokes, which were high transit corridors. This was in a developing country. This was not, one of those affluent European nations. This was in Brazil. So they created 5 spokes, and all the effort, there was a moratorium, so you could not develop in downtown. The only development you could do was along these corridors. And what the government did is put all the investment into these corridors. It took the right-of-way, it took the middle of the right-of-way and proposed high-speed bus transit. Now, why was it high-speed bus transit? Not because they liked it, but because they couldn't afford it. Now, that is a key point to think about. They didn't have a choice.
Couldn't afford rail.
They couldn't afford rail. So this was not about thinking whether we can do it or we cannot do it. There was no choice. And so you put the buses in the middle. It was creatively done with very high standard architecture. Just a small detail, when the bus stops are circular, and the bus stops are raised by about a foot from the ground, so that when you're standing on the bus stop, a wheelchair can just shoot into a bus rather than wasting time like we do in LA, standing and waiting and so on. So it was a very sophisticated system. At the same time, they wrote the regulations of mandating higher density along these corridors and stepping them down as they went into the neighborhoods. And of course, it was a dictatorship, so they could do a lot of things we can't do here. But the long story short, and neither has it been immune to corruption and exurban gated communities, but the fact is, Curitiba has grown for a third world city in a very transit-oriented way, which is a fantastic thing to think about. The other thing I want to bring up is, when they didn't have a choice, Jaime Lerner did a fantastic tactical engagement with the low-income groups. What he did is he said, the city cannot afford to bring all the buses in, but we'll make a deal with you. We will give you the buses. So if you're a driver, a potential driver, I will give you a bus. You pay me some money for some of the infrastructure that we're going to build for you. So the potential drivers paid some of the infrastructure money for the infrastructure in advance. They got the buses. It was a business transaction. Life went on. Today, 85% of Curitiba takes public transit. So I'm telling you the happy part of the story. There are a lot of parts that I'm not telling you, of course. But the bottom line is an incredible case study in bridging the gap between rich and poor through many, many simultaneous notions that I think we think about. But the reason is, many times they didn't have a choice. And today, with all the economic vibrancy, some of these bus lanes are being converted into trains slowly. There is now talk of converting them to trains after 40 years of success.
I was just going to say that while we have choices today, we haven't made access and awareness and the quality of that choice really easy to access. Again, we haven't made it easy for you to bike. We haven't made it easy for you to find out when that bus is coming or the quality of that bus experience. It's it's hot out or it's raining, and we haven't done anything to kind of accommodate the quality of those choices. So I think that that's really going to be where we're going to need to be focusing a lot of our effort.
And we're at an inflection point, I think, both by technology and mindset. With the coming of Expo to Santa Monica, where the line will come from USC all the way out to 4 blocks from our pier, we're committed to connecting up that last mile or that first mile for someone going the other direction. And that's the next step. Claire's absolutely right, is to make it easy for people to have many ways. So we're reshuffling our bus system. We're investing in pedestrian amenities around all of the stations, and we're and Vinayak made reference, we'll be the first city in Southern California to have a bike share program that will debut next month.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Let me pause and take some questions, because I promised that we'd do that right about this time. So, yeah.
The question I have is about the role of the private sector in public infrastructure and the challenges we have of delivering the world-class infrastructure called for in the plan with very limited budgets. And one of the things I've observed in LA, having worked throughout the Intermountain West and the Midwest a bit, is that we have a proclivity for infrastructure projects to create winners and losers. We like to have rail lines that get a lot of investment, and it's okay to let the rest of our infrastructure really fail and crumble in neighborhoods that are politically less powerful, as opposed to sort of saying, we have a minimum expectation for the quality of infrastructure. Anybody who's driven the 5 between LA County and Orange County knows those differences. You travel across jurisdictional boundaries and you feel a difference in the minimum expectation of infrastructure. We often get to rely on the private sector to help us in the development context, and we often look to them for public-private partnerships to deliver some of our major infrastructure projects. So I wonder if each of you could talk a little bit more about sort of what you see as the greatest benefits of those partnerships and maybe what we need to be mindful of too.
So I'll jump in. Two thoughts that are a little bit in tension with each other. Around the world over the last 10, 20 years, there has been an enthusiasm for triple P, public-private partnerships. I think the track record is checkered. It's been relatively successful at building some toll roads here and there and some bridges and whatnot. I think what's going on in London is probably the most ambitious and well thought out experiment in this, and I think there have been a lot of mistakes made, and I think London's learned from them. So I think we should be watching London as a great city, as a world city, thinking about how you think comprehensively and systematically. The piece of it, though, that I think will determine whether there's success or failure is whether the public sector is clearly in charge. Because at the moment, the public sector is in so many of these public-private partnerships has turned to the private sector in desperation to bail them out for avoiding hard decisions, right? We can't get the money, so you give us the money, you build it, and then we'll be in hock to you forevermore. And that model means that the private sector is going to take those projects that are going to make them the most money. I would too. So there has to be intentionality and the sense of equity that you're articulating. There has to be a sense that we're not going to just do this where we can, out of desperation, make some money for some private sector folks who've sold us a great storyline. We have to have a more comprehensive plan for rebuilding the infrastructure of Los Angeles. It's a huge undertaking, but again, Paris, the streets of Paris weren't built by tax money. That was a public-private partnership. They tore down the old neighborhoods, the medieval neighborhoods. They built the boulevards, and then they sold off the real estate to pay for the boulevards. So there's an opportunity, and again, I think of all of the world's cities, London has sort of figured out how to do this the right way, and it'll be interesting to see what the results of that will be if they're able to pull off the kind of comprehensive public-private partnerships that they're now embarking upon. I think it'd be a great model for American cities going forward.
I would, I haven't taken a look at London in terms of what they're doing, so that's good to know. I'll take a look at that. I think that in terms of public-private partnerships, I have a little fear of them in the way Rick described it. Some of the traditional public-private partnerships maybe haven't always worked out so well. The one that's kind of being talked about the most right now is the idea of entering into a 3P for the 405 corridor. And that actually honestly scares me, because the only way they're looking to finance that is actually to increase the vehicular capacity. And then that dramatically reduces the potential transportation demand, where I think that should simply be a tunnel for transportation. So I'm hoping that that plan gets kind of put aside, but I think that one of the ways to perhaps argue for an alternative is through Measure R2 that's being looked at. Everybody knows that we were very successful with Measure R, and there's talk about maybe getting a second ballot or second resolution or proposition whatever on the ballot next year. And I think that's actually an opportunity. That's me as an example, public-private partnership, because it's actually the public, all of us, which you could also say is the private sector, saying we're willing to tax ourselves to help pay for a system, so we're collectively and holistically kind of building out a system. So that, to me, I think is a real opportunity that we have. It's not necessarily in the vein of what you were thinking about, but I think that's a real opportunity. If we can really be successful with that, maybe we can push back against things like the 405 corridor. The other opportunity that I think of, it again, it's not in the traditional 3P, but we're taking one of the key things the mobility plan, I think, focuses on is also this idea of mobility hubs. We talked a lot about, your transit system, but you've also got, you need that first mile connection, because not every train or bus is going to go, or even protected bicycle lane is going to go right to your doorstep. So there's going to be these gaps. And so there's the need for the public sector to be making sure that they're bringing in the bicycle share, they're putting the improvements in the street, but there's also an opportunity when development does occur in and around these stations to make sure that we're perhaps either requiring, so maybe it's part of looking at our zoning code, so that developments that go then in that area, have to provide a certain amount of kind of the amenities that we think are critical to making a real successful mobility hub. So there's uses that are there, active and open and clean and available, for the much of the day people are actually, day and night people are actually riding, or that it's well lit and it's got, again, kind of the services people need. So.
We're embarking upon something just in the last, the council approved it 3 weeks ago. We proposed that the 4 projects that were being individually considered, like what does the developer want to do here? Rather, we set the development proposals aside and enter into a comprehensive approach that's transportation based. Because the parcels are right next to the 10 freeway, where the 10 freeway dumps into the 1, and you have one of the world's worst freeway off-ramps, the 4th and 5th Street in Santa Monica. Just a nightmare for 50 years. There's a potential to not only untangle the spaghetti there, but also shift parking away from the center of downtown and therefore reduce vehicle traffic inside the downtown, shift the parking out to the periphery from the center, demolish those old seismically unsafe parking lots that were such a catalyst for development 40 and 50 years ago, but which now really have lived their useful life. Bridge over the freeway, which is this huge scar from 1965 that divides the healthy downtown from the civic center, and to put the public sector objectives ahead, say this is what we want to achieve, and then talk about private sector development to support that in the context of a comprehensive plan. So I think it's really important to put the public sector in the driver's seat, not to be reactive to private sector initiative, but again, to capture back the public value in the form of potential future complementary and congruent private sector development. If we bridge over that freeway, we've done something that you don't do anymore, which is build land in a community that's on the California coast, right? That's why Will Rogers back in the 30s said, you know, buy land by the coast of California because God's not making it anymore. We could, us and Caltrans, which is the closest thing, could actually manufacture land in a coastal community that right now is an ugly, dirty, noisy freeway. But that's going to create value. Value can be plowed back into public parkland, but also can be plowed back into appropriate human-scale urban development that will generate value to pay for the significant capital costs of recapturing that land.
Well, let me mention, I want to take a few more questions and try to pitch the first one to you, Vinayak, since it's kind of your turn, so to speak. We have about 10 minutes left, so I would encourage the questioners to try to be brief, and I will encourage our answerers to try to be brief to see how many questions we can draw. So right here in the middle. Yeah, you.
First of all, I live in Atwater Village. I was stunned at what you said about it, because if you talk to the community, they don't think, the reason it has, there's a lot of aspects about it that you don't even bring into talking about how it's this reasoned development. No, it's not this reasoned development. It was an undesirable community until a few years ago. People keep trying to come in. They're meeting tremendous resistance. The LA River is there. It is impacting what's happening. The community wouldn't agree with you that it's such a great example of, they're very concerned about the way the community is going. And it also has an equestrian center and a lot of parkland because of the river. It has no infrastructure to accommodate the kind of development that you're alluding to, which, I mean, I know I've seen Silver Lake, I've seen Echo Park. Echo Park was very upset as well because the community got together and asked to improve it, and when they did, all the developers came in and took it over and forced those people out because they couldn't afford to be there anymore. I think in terms of the public-private partnership, maybe you might consider the public encompassing more of the community if you're trying to develop or impact. And also, I also want to give you a plus. I lived on the East Coast. I lived in Ann Arbor. When I lived in Ann Arbor, I took my bike everywhere. We rode everywhere. That was because people expected us to be there. I moved to LA and I rode my bike about 2 weeks and I got off it because you're taking your life in your hands to ride a bike in LA. So you might, I mean, and now I won't do it anymore, but when I do drive, which is very rarely, I take the bus or I walk whenever I can. Anything you can do to help ease that would be wonderful. And the bus system has vastly improved since I moved to LA. But maybe you need to also start a development and educational program for bikers because they're out there at night without any lights on their bikes. They're out there weaving all over the lane. Like they're totally unconscious motorists. So it works both ways. It isn't just one way or the other. It's what I like to put forward to you.
Let me move to you. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I think you're ready to have it next.
This is neither Copenhagen nor Tokyo in terms of the political structure, in terms of the grain of the city, et cetera, et cetera. How do you measure its success? How do you know that it's working? Is it a whole different set of metrics that we look at? If so, I mean, can you sort of allude to that a little bit? And how is it different from the way we've looked at streets before?
Sure. I mean, there definitely are a number of objectives we have associated with each of the 5 goals in the plan. So one of them is, reducing the number of collisions we have. And we have, it's almost a preposterous one, again, like the Vision Zero, saying we have an objective, though, to say, let's reduce collisions to 0. Are we going to get to 0? Probably not. But at least it's a way of measuring. And so we can look at that year by year and see really whether the kind of improvements we're doing, what kind of impact they're having. We also talk about increasing or decreasing the vehicle miles traveled. So again, these are things that we measure today, how many miles people are traveling. And so if you have done the kind of improvements we've talked about today, making it much more pleasant and accessible to walk or to take transit or to bicycle, then we're going to, and then combine that then with, again, a greater amount of kind of land uses that are filling people's needs, you're going to hopefully then see a reduction in the miles people are actually traveling. So it's just a couple of them. When we look at, we want to reduce, we want to improve, the air quality. We want to reduce this, the stormwater pollutants. So all those things are measurable ways of seeing how the plan is doing.
23 years ago, when Pasadena adopted their general plan, and it had to go to the voters for their approval, which is unusual in California, it was based upon 7 principles. The language of the 7 principles was in the ballot measure that 58% of the voters of Pasadena approved on Election Day. And one of the 7 principles, Pasadena will be a city where people can circulate without cars. It didn't say we'll be a city without cars. It'll be a city where you can get where you want to go, and you will not have only the choice of getting there by car. 23 years later, Pasadena is well on its way to becoming that kind of city with the Gold Line, with transit-oriented development, with the local arts buses, with the recent Ciclavia and the increase in bike and pedestrian mobility, with the crowds you see in the downtown today. So that's a very high goal. And 23 years ago, people thought it was ludicrous, right? That was when you listen to the radio and nobody walks in LA, right? And yet, the voters of Pasadena committed themselves to do that, and over the last 23 years, we've made enormous progress toward making Pasadena a city where people can circulate without cars.
Vinayak, quite possibly.
No more questions?
Let me give, if brief. Okay.
I'm glad you talked about politics, and it was being covered from Times more only yesterday. Critics say they weren't consulted early enough in this process, and that's a repeat theme in development and planning. I'd like to know if you think that's an expression of not having liked the outcomes, or if they think that they really were not included in this process, as you mentioned, it's been going on 4 years, and how we might improve that, where we are millions of people, not everyone will have a voice in every planning project.
I think the people who are complaining that there wasn't enough outreach are people who didn't like the outcome. That's the quick, simple answer. Can you do more outreach? Absolutely. It is a challenge in a city of 4 million people to reach everybody and to get people involved.
Vinayak, let me bring that back to you, and then we'll close with Rick.
Yep.
Yep.
Oh,
That's
the
right.
question, you mean?
Yeah.
I was not ready for that. No, I'm going to skip that. I have no knowledge of the nuances of what happened to the outreach process in this plan. So.
Okay. Rick?
Well, it's back to arithmetic. I deeply believe in representative democracy. Spent 30 years in public life with all of the challenges and frustrations and victories and losses that come with committing yourself to trying to achieve consensus and achieve forward progress. In Pasadena, we spent a ton of money and a ton of effort to ensure that everyone who wanted to be involved in the general plan process was involved, because we had to go to the ballot box, right? If the mobility plan had to go to the voters of Los Angeles, I guarantee you there would have been broader outreach, right? We knew we had to go and have not just the city council vote on our plan, but the voters. And when a plan is this thick, right, all the voters have to do is find one sentence that somebody puts in there and highlights. Did you know that this plan includes the following? And even if it's not true, the default is vote no, right? Right? I'm not sure I want to do that, so I'll just vote no. We got 58% of the people to vote yes. So that was based upon profound and genuine outreach. Not that everyone agreed, because that's impossible in a city of 125 or 130,000 people. But everybody felt like they had had their say and that they were listened to. That is hard in a city of 4 million. But I guarantee you, if the next plan for the city of Los Angeles had to go to the voters on Election Day, there would be plenty of outreach to make sure that they had behind it, as there was with Measure R, because that requires a 2/3 vote, right? And so, in order to win in a democracy, you have to do your homework, not unlike getting an A in the class.